Well, hello, everyone. Good afternoon, and welcome to Ocean Expert Exchange. Scientists in every Florida school and the Anjari Foundation are excited to have you join our live webinar events on ocean science and technology experts. With you here today, we're excited to bring you this monthly series. We dive into all things marine science and explore what's happening into the field, interesting careers, and more. And as I said, today we're super excited. Dr. Rochelle Tanner of Chapman University will be talking with us about the amazing and fascinating world of nudibranchs. Before we jump right into it, we'd like to tell you just quickly a little bit about our programs. The Scientist in Every Florida School is a free program. They're housed at the University of Florida's Thompson Earth Systems Institute, and the mission of CEFS is to engage Florida K-12 students and teachers in cutting-edge research and provide scientists role models and experiences like today that we hope will inspire future stewards of our planet. Anjari Foundation is a nonprofit headquartered in West Palm Beach, Florida, and the foundation supports and promotes marine science research and education. And many of the foundation's primary initiatives involve its 65-foot research vessel, the RV Anjari. In case you missed it, any of the information in today's previous slides, of course, we will remind you that you can submit questions to our scientists by typing them in the chat box at any time. So at this time, I'm going to go ahead and stop share and turn things over and introduce you to Dr. Rochelle Tanner. Dr. Tanner, if you'd like to go ahead and take a moment to share your screen, we'll let you take it from here. Thank you.
Great, thank you. I'm so happy to be here today. My name is Dr. Tanner. I'm a professor at a smaller university in California called Chapman University. So we are in Southern California, about 15 minutes away from the beach. Before I tell you about the wonderful world of nudibranchs, I want to tell you a little bit about how I got here. This is me in the field doing what I love, finding sea slugs. You'll find me sitting in the mud or between the rocks in the surf most of the time that we're out in the field, or scuba diving. And my trusty sidekick is my dog. His name is Koa, which means warrior, which is kind of funny because he's so fluffy and definitely not ferocious at all. But my research students really, really love him, maybe more than me. And he is a mainstay of our research lab. Now, I have loved nudibranchs ever since I figured out what they were in high school. And that's me dressed as a nudibranch for a spirit day when I was in high school. And when I was growing up, I didn't really know about other careers out there because I'm a first generation American and my mom is from Hong Kong. And so for us, it was either you can be an engineer, you can be a doctor, you can be a lawyer, and there's really nothing else out there. But luckily, my parents let me go to this public school that was really big on the arts and the sciences, and I got exposed to all these different programs and volunteer opportunities when I was really young. And so because of that, someone at the Seattle Aquarium kind of challenged me and said, you know, we never find any nudibranchs, you're never going to find one, but they're really cool and you should look out for them. And I guess I took that really to heart because I went into my undergraduate degree at the University of Southern California. And I got 2 degrees. Like I said, I went to a music high school. And so I actually have a music undergraduate degree from the conservatory at USC. I also have an undergraduate degree in environmental studies. And as part of that, I did a lot of scientific diving in the tropics, but also here off the coast on Catalina Island, which we lovingly refer to as the Galapagos of California because of how much biodiversity there is. After I did my undergraduate degrees, I went and got a PhD in integrative biology, which just means that I looked at lots of different approaches to answering fundamental biological questions about ecosystems. And the ecosystem that I chose was, of course, those nudibranchs. Couldn't wait to get back to them. When I was an undergrad, I studied fish, but I really wanted to get back to the slugs. And what I found out very quickly was this meant that I was going to spend my degree cleaning aquariums and fixing the electrical and plumbing systems that came along with them. That was the majority of what I did in graduate school, but they gave me a PhD for it. I learned a lot about a lot of different types of sea slugs. A lot of them I was the first one to publish on because no one had really looked into them. And that's kind of become the hallmark of what my research program, or at least that part of my research program, is about. So after I finished my PhD, I did a series of both academic and nonprofit positions as a professional scientist, I guess is the broadest category. I did work in bioinformatics, which is like the big data part of computational biology. I did a lot of field science. I still love to go out into the field, diving, snorkeling, all of it. I went back to my undergraduate roots in environmental management and policy, looking at questions that had to do with how do we manage humans and the environment in the same system because we are all part of the same world. This was particularly relevant because I'm in California and I don't know how much, depending on where you're from, how much you know about California, but we have a lot of people here. And those people live really close to these ecosystems that are really important. And so environmental management is a huge, huge research area here. I also started to foray into the nonprofit world of strategic communication for climate change. And that's actually how I got connected with these folks, is we have a colleague in common through that endeavor. And so I actually joined the board and became the science director of an organization called the National Network for Ocean and Climate Change Interpretation right after I finished graduate school. And what we did was we supplied framing and language to communicate about climate change at all sorts of informal education centers like zoos, aquariums, museums, national parks, all of that. And we did it from a social science research base of evidence. And I found that really interesting. And so even though I had this background, very rich background in fundamental biology, I found myself looking for faculty jobs as a professor in this area that was inherently interdisciplinary. I really wanted to keep doing social science of how humans are playing such a big role in environmental management, but I also really still loved those slugs. And so I became a professor at Chapman in 2021. And as part of this role, it's really unique. I get to do lots of things in the humanities, the social sciences, and the fundamental sciences. And I serve on a lot of commissions and national and international governing boards for environmental management and climate change impacts, especially with respect to rapid response strategies. And what this means is I am really interested in knowing how we can continue to thrive, not only humans, but the ecosystems that we're part of as climate change marches forward. And I'm going to tell you a little bit about Nudibranchs, which, for me has become this story of resilience because they're actually going to be pretty okay with climate change. And there's a lot of interesting things behind that and really great science that comes along with that. Okay, so this is a nudibranch, one of them. They come in all sorts of shapes and colors and sizes. And they're really, really hard to find. And I don't know whether you can tell from this photo, but it's about the size of your fingernail. Depending on how old you are, it might be your thumb or it might be your pinky. And there are so many different species, such that people at museums are continuing to discover new species every day, especially in the tropics. And it turns out that they live in tide pools. Those are the ones that I study. They live at all depths of the ocean, but the ones that I study in tide pools. There are many, many species that live in the same area, but they look really different and they do really different things in their ecosystem service. And so we really don't know why, or we didn't until my research group started looking into it. And we've really only scratched the surface of understanding how they're all related to each other, let alone understanding how their bodies function and how they interact with other things in their environment. One thing we do know, or we assume about them, is that these guys are really soft. They have no shell. And when you're being exposed to air twice a day because they're in the intertidal, they should not really have a good shot at surviving because they're soft and they can dry out really easily. They should be really vulnerable to climate change, but they're not. And so we kind of set out to understand why. I want to point out some basic characteristics of what you're looking at, just so you know which way is up on a nudibranch. These rhinopores at their head are kind of their way of sensing all of the environment around them. So you can think of that as like their nose, their eyes, and their ears all in one. Some of them have serrata, which are these tendrils that come off of their body, and they can store cool things in them that help protect themselves or, have different colorations in them, but not every nudibranch has them. The thing that gives nudibranchs their name is their gills, and you can't quite see it on this one, so I'm going to show you a couple more pictures of different species of nudibranchs. But their gills are on the outside of their body in a little fluff. And nudibranch, it means naked gills. So that's kind of why they're named what they are, and they're the only mollusk that has this. Okay, here's another picture of a nudibranch. You can see the gills a lot more clearly on this guy because he doesn't have any serrata. And the rhinopores are a little smaller, but they're in the same place. And so this is the way that they sense the world. This guy is a yellow dorid. It's maybe a little bit bigger, maybe the size of like one section of your finger. This one is kind of the star of California nudibranchs. This is the one that a lot of amateur tide poolers know about because it's so bright and a little easier to find than the rest of them. What's really interesting about this one is that it's all one color. So it's kind of hard to pick out where its rhinopores are and where its gills are, but they're a little bit different texture than the serrata. This is the Hopkins rose nudibranch. This kind of set off a California scale investigation of what is the relationship to climate change. So it got picked up by a lot of news organizations when I was in grad school, and people were just asking the question, why do we see so many of these and it's getting warmer? I thought that things out on the coast were supposed to do worse when it gets warmer. Why are these guys everywhere now? And my friend and I in grad school said, well, we study other nudibranchs. Let's see if we can figure this out. And we did. And so that's kind of what has set me on my professional career of studying these particular nudibranchs. This is a picture of scale, how big they are. These are some different kinds that I've seen. And so these are on the smaller end, but pretty average. That's my hand in the background. And so they're quite tiny. So you can imagine that they're really, really hard to find. But people are very persistent to the point where on iNaturalist, there are over 250,000 observations of these in the world. And so you can imagine that people are really, really invested in finding these. This is a video just so you can see all the different types that we typically find in tide pools. There's a little blue guy. They can be brown. They don't have to be brilliantly colored. Those are just the ones that a lot of people like. And they exist in all sorts of environments in tide pools. That's a closely related, it's not a nudibranch, but it's a sea slug, which we'll talk a little bit about at the end. But they are just pretty much all types of diversity that you can think of. They come in every single color and color combination, especially in the tropics. Some of them are really cool, and this is something that very few other animals do. They can incorporate other animals and plants into their own body plan for their own benefit. And so I know of one that can eat plants and put undigested chlorophyll cells on its back to create food. So it becomes a plant basically in its own body. Another one can eat stinging anemone cells and carefully, without firing the cells, incorporate those stinging cells onto its serrata without getting stung. And so then when someone touches the nudibranch, it can sting other things. They're too small for us to be harmed by them, but it deters predators from eating them. Another cool thing about them is that they're both male and female at the same time, and the clinical term for this is hermaphrodite. So they can be mom or dad when they have offspring, and this improves their genetic diversity, especially because there's so few of them out there. They can have a little bit of a hard time finding a mate. And the last thing that's cool, but more cool that we're doing something about it, is that we really don't know anything about their ecology. We know some things about how they're related, but we don't really know how they interact with the natural world. So I'm going to share with you today some brand new research that my lab has worked on over the last decade. So the first thing that was established by some of my colleagues was that nudibranchs, we tend to see them more on the west coast of the US, during El Nino conditions. And in California, El Nino is like a household name because we are very much impacted by it. But I'm sure, depending on where you are, you may have never heard of this term or might not be familiar with what it does. So El Nino is very well known in California because it brings rain, and we don't get a lot of rain. And so El Nino conditions mean that our reservoirs get filled. So a lot of people think about it like that. But as an ocean scientist, I think of El Nino as what's happening under the ocean. Turns out that it's both an ocean and atmospheric circulation. And what's happening below the ocean is there's lots of layers of different temperatures of water in the Pacific Ocean, and really every ocean. But in the Pacific Ocean, we tend to have our cold, nutrient-rich water really close to the surface compared to Florida's coasts. And what this means is that our fisheries are really productive. During El Nino conditions, this cold, nutrient-dense water gets pushed down, further down where the fish can't get to it because of what's happening in the atmosphere. And what this means is that the coastal water, where these nudibranchs live and all different other kinds of biodiversity, gets warmer and it doesn't have as much food in it. But for some reason, they love it. It might have something to do with the circulation pattern that they settle out more easily as babies. But whatever it is, they tend to thrive in this, whereas everything else is not so happy. Now, this was proposed as a hypothesis by some of my colleagues, and since they were not ecologists or physiologists, they didn't test it. But we went and tested this, and we found out that it is definitely right, and there's some mechanisms behind why this is true. So nudibranchs are, even though you see them all over, seemingly randomly scattered in tide pools, they're actually selecting certain seaweeds or algae to live on that happen to stay cooler in the sun for longer. And this is similar to how you experience heat in your neighborhood. So if you have a neighborhood that's full of concrete or hard surfaces, it tends to feel hotter than if you had a tree next to you. This is kind of what's happening with these nudibranchs. And so we took hundreds of photoquadrats, which is what's happening over here. This is a square, a quadrat that we take a uniform photo of to look at biodiversity and look at conditions within a tide pool. And we looked at this all over California, and we also brought back samples of seaweeds to heat up in a lab environment to see whether our hypothesis was correct about nudibranchs living on seaweeds that stay cooler. And we found that it was correct. And we also found that nudibranchs in the lab, if we heat up the water to the maximum point where they can no longer live, they can live in water that's up to 10 degrees warmer than the hottest temperature we ever see in the wild, which is pretty hot. It's almost to the point of cellular, protein denaturation, which basically means that the physical properties of the cell can no longer hold together. That's when they lose their ability to hang around, which is pretty impressive. Most animals can't do that. And so what this means is that they're an indicator of coastal biodiversity. We actually found that they're an indicator of higher biodiversity in seaweeds, which makes sense because seaweeds do better in warmer conditions because they can grow quicker and they have more access to carbon dioxide. But they're also an indicator of lower animal biodiversity when you find lots of them. And so given this knowledge and given the fact that they're so hard to find, but people really love to look for them, we can use public records of people going out and looking for nudibranchs in their local habitats, like if you report them on iNaturalist, to get a sense of how healthy our coasts are in terms of biodiversity as an indicator. And this leaves scientists more time to figure out solutions to warming oceans instead of figuring out, well, what is healthy or not? We've got an indicator of healthiness that the public is really invested in. I just wanted to show you one more picture of what nudibranchs can look like around the world. These are some photos from my colleague, Dr. Kimo Morris, from his recent trip to Japan. They are just come in all sorts of shapes and sizes and colors, and I highly recommend that you look up what these look like. So I said I would come back to this. Sea hares are technically not nudibranchs. I was not asked to talk about these, but these are really my favorite. This is what I did my PhD research on. These are the eelgrass sea hares, the vacuum cleaners of the sea, and they eat off all of the gross stuff off of eelgrass beds, and they keep them healthier than any other grazer species out there. And this means that the eelgrass can be more efficient at photosynthesis. And you might be thinking, why do we care about eelgrass? Well, eelgrass beds are what protect our coasts from storm surges, including mitigating the effects of hurricanes because they slow the water coming towards the land. They also store a lot of carbon and provide nursery habitat for lots of fishery species. And so I really love these guys, and we still work a lot with them. These are their close relatives. This is a type of sea hare that you can actually find in Florida. And they're really cool because they're used in neuroscience research. The first genome of mollusks was sequenced from these guys. And they have the precursor to our neurological wiring in a big mass in their body. So neuroscience researchers really like to use these guys. They live all over the world. There are many species. But the thing that my students love the most is that they can get to really massive sizes. Some people say as big as a basketball. So I hope you enjoyed some little facts about nudibranchs and learning about the research that we're doing in my lab. I'm happy to take any questions that you have, and we mainly use TikTok, but sometimes we're on Instagram. That's our handle, and here's all of our socials. Thanks.
Okay, we're going to start some questions. I'm going to turn things over to my colleague Carla, who will hop on and moderate the questions coming in currently from the chat box.
Great. Thank you so much for teaching us about nudibranchs and sharing your research with us today. We do have a couple of questions from the chat, so we'll just go ahead and start those. Ross would like to know how fast nudibranchs can move, and if they usually live their lives in one area or travel between regions.
Yeah, that's a great question. So since they're so tiny and they can't swim, although there are some swimming species out there, but the ones we study can't swim, they're not very fast at all. A big journey for them might be going from one tide pool to the one next to it. So they're definitely not traversing our coasts. But they do move those very small movements between tide pools, which we've tested in the lab to see whether they can have any sort of thermoregulatory behavior, which they do. But it's like inches versus feet.
Amy wonders what nudibranchs predators are and if they face other ecosystem risks.
Yeah, so the main predators of nudibranchs are other nudibranchs. Um, the bright colors in any animal tends to suggest that it's not something that you should eat to other animals. But there is one that like really loves to eat other nudibranchs, and it follows the slime trails to find them. If you want to search on YouTube, it's like really scary, kind of, because it's so fast in the way that it eats it. It's called a Navinax. And there was a picture on one of my slides of those. Other threats, they're very specific in the food that they like to eat, and that's not something we know a lot about. But that could be why we don't find them a lot of places, is that's a threat to them. If they can't find the one food they love, they're very picky, they're not going to live. But other than that, they're pretty resilient.
Peter states that nudibranchs are relatively few and far between. Would the environment miss them if they were to disappear?
Yeah. So they've definitely been few and far between during my lifetime, but it's changed a lot, and that might be by region. We are seeing like hundreds of them in California now, and we never used to see that, which is why now we can do all this research that we couldn't do before. We don't know whether we would miss them. Presumably, they hold some sort of ecological niche, which means that they have a complex interaction with other species out there. But we don't know. Nobody's done that research.
Paul asks, does the size of the leaf or algae affect the temperature variance?
You're asking about the preference for seaweeds that are cooler or not. It's actually the physical property of the material of the plant. And so, yes, it could the specific heat capacity would probably change based on how big the little piece is, but we were testing the like material properties of the plant itself. Hopefully that answered that.
And Katie asks what the name of the last nudibranch you showed in your slide was.
The very last one, the really big one, the genus name is Aplysia, Aplysia, and there are different species all over the world, but we have Aplysia californica because we're California, and Aplysia vicaria, which is the black sea hare.
We have a few more. These are all great questions. Paul is interested to know if specific nudibranchs seem to prefer certain algae.
Yes, they do. But one of the problems we run into, which I think it came up in a few questions ago, is that sometimes we don't find enough of these to get a good sample size to definitively say that they prefer one or the other. But we can definitely make some observations in the field, which is a very like natural history approach, which is coming back in science, this observational ecology. And so the pink one seems to like surf grass, which is a very, very thin type of grass in the intertidal zone. And the ones that look like orange and white spotted clowns, it's the clown Triopha, they really like the seaweed called Egregia, which is the feather boa kelp. And we think this has something to do with their relative thermal tolerance versus the heat capacity of the seaweed.
Robert asks, how many types of nudibranchs have been identified, and what would be your guess on how many types actually exist?
I have no idea. And that is a question for Dr. Terry Goslinger at the California Academy of Science, who is regarded as kind of the father of nudibranch science. It is thousands, and it's kind of an interesting question of how many we think are out there. They're really hard to find. We haven't explored most of our oceans, so we have no idea. And there's some evidence to show that mollusks are some of the most rapidly diversifying groups on the planet right now, and we don't know why. I mean, that might just be dynamics of over evolutionary time. It might have something to do with they're particularly well suited to climate warming. But the short answer is I have no idea. I just know that there's way more out there than we know about.
Paul's class is wondering if if the specific neurological conditions that the nudibranchs are used to test for, what are they?
I don't know because I'm not a neuroscientist. I do know that they're one of the main study the model systems that we use for neuroscience, and they've been used for the last almost 30 years. So I'm assuming that those researchers have explored everything they can. The really good thing for them is that this is an invertebrate, which means that it doesn't have the same sort of pain receptors that vertebrates might have. And so this is a more ethical type of research, doing this research in invertebrates. And so I'm assuming that they've really looked at a lot of things.
Good to know. Samaya is wondering, how do they reproduce, and are they found in blooms?
So the sea hares and the nudibranchs, which are like groups that are related under sea slugs, the sea hares have this cool way of kind of giving each other a hug like this, where they donate sperm to each other at the same time because they're hermaphrodites. And sometimes they can form chains of these, which I guess you could consider a bloom. The scientists use a more crude word for what that is. But the nudibranchs, I've never observed it. They have the same anatomy as a sea hare, so I would assume that they do it the same way, where they just kind of line up together and exchange packets of sperm. But I've never seen it.
Several in the chat are wondering if nudibranchs are mainly found in the California area, or if they can be found on the East Coast, for instance, New Jersey, New England, or Florida area.
Oh, definitely. They are definitely on the East Coast. I think just in terms of general biodiversity, we have a little bit more on the west coast of the US just because of that thermocline, the nutrient-rich waters that I was talking about. There just tends to be more biodiversity where those are more present, but there's definitely still nudibranchs on the coast, especially in Florida, because you're nearing the tropics and there are lots and lots of nudibranchs in the tropics.
Lucy says we've spotted nudibranchs floating along the surface of the water in Florida. And would this be because they're trying to get sunlight or for another reason?
There are some species of nudibranchs that swim. And so I'm not sure which ones they were, whether they were the swimming ones or not. If they were not the swimming ones, we sometimes see that over here. And what's happening is they're trying to get to an area that has conditions that they prefer. And so since they can't swim and since they don't move very fast, this is kind of their only hope. And so they gather up their mucus and make a little raft, a little bubble, and they float along until they decide that they want to try and drop back to the habitat.
Does temperature variation decrease population density in some species?
Temperature variation decrease population density. I don't think anyone knows that. I think those kinds of studies, again, require there to be a lot of data and a lot of nudibranchs to be found out there. And the problem with them is that they're kind of an anomaly, like they're kind of hard to spot. And so in order to get a good sense of what a population is at a certain field site and then tie that back to temperature variation, we just like don't have enough nudibranchs to know that. What I can tell you is that when we bring them into the lab and we expose them to higher temperature variation, they do fine. There's just a trade-off between how well they can do with variation and how well they can do with the maximum habitat temperature. This is called the trade-off hypothesis in physiology. And so nudibranchs are one species that uphold the trade-off hypothesis. So the short answer is no, it shouldn't impact them, but we don't have field-based data for that.
And on a related note, Paul asks if nudibranchs show seasonal patterns or changes.
Yes. So almost all species have some like a recruitment period. And so nudibranchs are no different than that. It is something that is rapidly changing with climate change. And so I think, 5 years ago, I would have told you, well, on the California coast, they definitely lay eggs in the fall and then hatch out in February. And we see lots of them in February. And then they go through another period and then we see lots of them in July again. But that's changing. And that's kind of throwing a wrench into our field plans because we don't actually know anymore.
Kind of related to that. Vanessa asks if, as hermaphrodites, nudibranchs tend to have single offspring or have been monitored to have multiple offspring in a single lifespan.
They definitely have multiple offspring. So living in the intertidal zone, it's a really dynamic and dangerous environment. So you've got the waves crashing down, you've got the sun beating down on you. And so it's really not advantageous to have one baby because the likelihood of it surviving is pretty low. And so they are mollusks. They have egg clutches. They lay these little strings of gelatinous eggs that stick to rocks that the larvae, they don't take care of it either. And so they just kind of lay it and then they walk away from it. And the little eggs, they develop and they, once they become a certain stage, they drift out to open ocean and they develop more out there. And then they come back to settle, maybe not on the same beach, maybe a different beach, maybe the same beach. This is another black box of marine biology. We don't understand larval dispersal in like a quantitative way. We know the mechanism, but they have hundreds per clutch, and then they can lay dozens of clutch per season, and they live about a year. So quite a few.
We are interested to know if they communicate or make sound.
Not sound we can hear. Maybe they make sounds that we don't know about. They definitely communicate through their rhinopores. It's another thing that those neuroscientists probably know a lot more about than me. but that's where all of their sensory organs are collected. I do know that they can follow each other's slime trails, and they can secrete certain pheromones or hormones into those slime trails to communicate certain things, either on like a chronic timescale or an acute timescale where, you know, if there's a danger, they could probably pick that up from things that a nudibranch has left behind.
And we have someone interested in studying nudibranchs and wondered if you or your colleagues know of any open positions and how they can get into the field.
Yeah, it's a great question. I am at an institution that focuses on undergraduate education. We have some graduate programs, but my calling is undergraduate students and undergraduate training and working with the public. There are a couple groups out there. I mean, I mentioned Terry Goslinger at Cal Academy is really the person to talk to about nudibranch, all things nudibranchs. But there's definitely groups, other places that are doing this. I know that there's a lot of research groups in Australia that know a lot more about the Australian nudibranchs than we know about our American nudibranchs. But yeah, Terry is the big one. And I know my colleagues in the local area, but that's pretty biased to California.
Oh, that's great. And I have one final question. What is your favorite species of nudibranch and why?
Oh, it's like picking your favorite child, isn't it? I think, my easy answer is that the Hopkins Rose nudibranch, that really fluffy pink one, is my favorite. Not because I love it the most, but because it's really what brought me back into studying them after loving them for so long and just being a fan of them. That's really what's catapulted the research that I do now in this area, is having so many of them pop up in 2015. Yeah.
Thank you so much. I'll hand it back over to Stephanie for a closing.
Thank you, Carla. And thank you everyone so much for tuning in with us today. A very special thank you to Dr. Rochelle Tanner. She and all of the nudibranch she studies are probably some of the coolest things I've heard of as of late. So thank you for that. If you'd like to take a look at the K-12 extension resources and activities related to today's talk, you can find those along with the recording of today's session on the UF Earth Systems YouTube channel. And for more information on the Scientist in Every Florida School program or the Anjari Foundation, you can visit our web pages and follow us on social media, as you see here on your screen now. And we have 2 more events that are coming in the spring series, Ocean Expert Exchange. On March 13th, we'll be joined by Mike Lorette of Florida Power and Light Company, who will be talking with us about the work he does and conservation of American crocodiles at the Turkey Point Nuclear Plant in Southeast Florida. And then finally, our final Ocean Expert Exchange for the spring series will be held on April 20th, and will feature Lindy Knowles of the Bahamas National Trust, who'll be sharing his work to establish and manage marine protected areas. So in the meantime, on behalf of Scientists in Every Florida School and the Anjari Foundation, we want to say thank you very much to everyone for joining us on the call today, and we hopefully will see you at our future Ocean Expert Exchange. Thanks, everyone. Take care. Bye-bye.